Good morning, good morning. Welcome everyone to the Philadelphia Ethical Society. Who here is here for the first time? Raise your hand. Raise them high. First time. Well, welcome. And I have a brief introduction about who we are for the rookies in the room. Such a beautiful day today. So, the Ethical Society, in short, is a place to come together and try to build a more ethical society. It was started in the 1870s. In New York, we're one of 20 ethical societies around the country. The first Society for Ethical Culture, that's the name of the New York Society, Society for Ethical Culture. And again, it gives you that sense of what the purpose was, how to build a more ethical culture. The basic theory is the culture in that time, in the 1870s, the idea is the culture out there is too exploitative, doesn't provide dignity and worth to all, doesn't bring out the best in us. So how do we build an institution that can help do that? That was the basic premise of the first Society for Ethical Culture in New York City in 1875. And it was founded by a group of people that believed more or less three things. One, all people have inherent dignity and worth. Two, action is more important than words, deed before creed. And three, a proposal of a golden rule of sorts. Act so as to elicit the best in others. And this was in the 1870s, so a lot of the language they used at that time was not language we don't necessarily talk about deeds and creeds as much anymore. But so much of this DNA of the first ethical society is really relevant today. Maybe we can come together across divides and not be so alienated from each other just because we disagree about either the way the world works, our religious beliefs, our political associations. Maybe we can come together and do things in the world together and focus on the action rather than the belief system. That holds up really well. And so each society does this in a different way. And the early societies focused on all kinds of things. Solidarity with immigrant working class people. Solidarity across race lines. W.E.B. Du Bois in Philadelphia, together with the founder of the Society for Ethical Culture in New York, were the two American delegates to the first Congress on Race Relations in the UK. Building affordable housing projects. And in Philly, we focused 100 years ago on building an environmental education summer camp. And so Camp Linden, we have our camp, where's Amy, our camp director, and Paul, our super volunteer, our tour guide, are here from Camp Linden, an hour west of Philly today. Camp Linden this year is celebrating its 100th anniversary, and Camp Linden is the main community service project of the Ethical Society. It's the main way we here in Philadelphia programmatically put those values into action. And my new thing is when I go into rooms, I say, I'm Phil, and I'm with the Philadelphia Ethical Society, and we have a pool in the woods. Because that gets people's attention. It is a gorgeous property, and it is, together, we own and operate this building as a third space for democracy on Rittenhouse Square, and that property out in Camp Linden as a space for hundreds of kids from Philadelphia who don't get to experience nature as much, to go out and play with the bugs, to swim in the Brandywine, to look up at the stars, right? This is like the stuff that everybody should have access to. So I wanted to tell you a little bit for the newcomers about what we're doing, especially today, because we have such a wonderful guest speaker, Corina Newsome, to talk about, well, I'll let her talk about what she's going to talk about. I'll introduce her in a second, but, every week we gather here on Sunday, and we have just a few rituals that we do take part in. One is a moment of silence, and another is a sharing of joys and concerns. And so before we share out just brief joys and concerns that might be on our minds and in our hearts, I'm going to give you all about a minute just to relax your breath. Hopefully you might be hearing a few of the birds that have nests over in this direction that I'd like to hear during our moment of silence. So I'll give you a minute, and then I'll call you back in. Okay, welcome back. Who would like to share joy or concern? I'll come and find you with the mic.
As a lot of you know, I have 7 living brothers, and in a bizarre coincidence, 2 of them had a stroke on Monday. It's pretty bad, but my brother Glenn is back to himself. There's very little signs. They're calling it a TIA. Chris is struggling. He seems lucid and kind of verbally himself. So it's a lot worrisome. So I got my blood work done and blood pressure checked, and fortunately, I'm doing pretty okay. So that's it.
Thank you, Dan.
Good morning. I don't usually manifest so much winning in 1 week, but I was at the Phillies when they changed coaches and ended their losing streak. I was at the Sixers when they won Game 6 and watched them on TV when they won Game 7. And the Flyers are hanging in there, but most importantly, my son today woke himself up, which is a challenge, and ran the Broad Street run and finished.
You may have heard me a few weeks ago talking about the Sixers. So I'm about to turn 50, and that's a concern. And Paul George is the elderly person on the Sixers, and he was born when I was in high school. So, anyways, I wanted you to know that Joel Embiid had an appendectomy 2 weeks and 3 days after that. He went back into the playoffs. This is the first time we beat the Celtics in the playoffs since the early 80s. So, go Sixers.
Sure.
We had a volunteer day on Saturday at Camp Linden. I want to thank all the people who came, and Amy and Philip and Elise for putting it all together.
For joy. Paul.
On the Camp Linden team, just think it's a beautiful time in the spring to get out in the woods and enjoy nature. The ephemeral flowers are blooming around Camp Linden and Charlotte Lily. closest nature preserve and enjoy some time out there. Try to do it.
Thank you, Paul. I saw another hand. Okay, so another ritual we have is every week we listen to a little bit of music. And I'm really happy to have Jake Kelberman with us today. Jake, you can come up as I'm speaking. I was really happy to be reunited by chance with my preschool teacher who works with Jake, running a music venue in South Philly out of his house. Jake's the president of an organization called Not So Latin, and they have wonderful live music. It's sort of like Tiny Desk, but in South Philly. And I'm looking forward to working with Jake and Patricio. And they've got tons of ideas on how to bring more music to Ethical Society, although we have tons of music already. I would say a little bit of music history. Bob Dylan played his first show here when he first came to Philly. On this stage, and supposedly there were only like 15, 20 people in the crowd because it was before he got popular. I struggled selling tickets that first show. Give a round of applause for Jake Kelberman. Thank you, Jake. It's gonna be stuck in my head all day. Okay. So, born and raised in Philadelphia, Corina Newsome is a wildlife biologist dedicated to the advancement of justice-centered conservation science, policy, and practice. She earned her bachelor's degree in zoo and wildlife biology from Malone University and her master's degree in biology from Georgia Southern University. And she serves as the conservation scientist on National Wildlife Federation's science team. With a specific passion for avian conservation, Corina's research has focused on answering landscape ecology questions to help birds thrive in a changing world. Corina's fascination with birds extends beyond her research and into the communities where she lives and works, serving as beautiful vehicles through which she connects herself and others to the world around them. In addition to her work as a wildlife scientist, Corina is committed to increasing the representation and visibility of Black science professionals for the next generation of STEM experts, and centering the leadership and perspectives of Black, Indigenous, and communities of color in wildlife conservation, environmental education, and exploration of the natural world. Her passion for birds started with the blue jay. Welcome, Corina Newsome.
Thank you so much, Phil. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for the warm welcome, and I'm always thrilled to be in the company of other nature enthusiasts. And I don't like keeping here all day, which is always the temptation when we're talking about wildlife and birds. So I'm going to set a timer on my watch right now, and if I go longer than you feel like hearing me, you can just scream, and I'll walk off the stage. In my work as a wildlife scientist, as Phil articulated just now, the work that I do as a biologist is rooted in advancing environmental justice for people, ensuring the environmental concerns and social inequities that communities face are addressed as part of the work of conserving wildlife and biodiversity. And so over the course of my career, I've had the real pleasure of having the opportunity to closely observe and study living organisms and their ecosystems, and chief among them being birds, of course. And as a researcher, I was studying their biology, their ecology, sometimes their morphology or physical structures. But I first started out as a zookeeper. I got my start at the Philadelphia Zoo, actually. And in those contexts, I had the opportunity not just to study species or populations or ecosystems, but to build relationships with individual creatures and just witness how diverse they are within species and across species. And so as I've studied and worked in this field, I've borne witness to the incredible life across this planet. And I've also come to realize that nature holds a substantial amount of wisdom for our lives. It holds answers to a lot of the questions that have plagued humanity for years, decades, centuries, millennia. And looking to nature for solutions is called biomimicry. All right, hold on, it just went black for me. Let's see. Oh, which area? The right, okay. Cool, perfect, thank you, okay. So as a society, our typical understanding of biomimicry is usually in the context of technology, right? We look for species and creatures that are fast, that move efficiently, that move silently, that can protect really sensitive tissues in their bodies. And this is just one example of some sort of bullet train that was fashioned after the morphology of a kingfisher that can fly very efficiently through the air and dive into the water with minimal resistance and maximum speed. And so we look to nature to say, hey, how can we make our technology better and more efficient? But there is actually so much more to what nature can provide to us as far as wisdom is concerned. And so I have to give a shout out. I have to start by giving a shout out to a colleague and friend of mine. His name is Billy Allman. He actually has a master's in biomimicry. He's a Disney Imagineer. He has a very strong technical background and a very strong artistic background. And he is really the one who expanded my horizons on this to understand that nature really does have so much more to tell us about how to live. Nature can show us how to be good community members, how to problem solve, how to rely more heavily on our actions than our words, to show the people and communities that we live in that we care for them. And so right now, more than ever, people across the country and across the world are recognizing the importance of cultivating relationships and partnerships in their communities that are sustainably prepared to mobilize quickly to protect each other, to provide for one another, and to invest in the ability for the whole person to thrive, for every person in the community. And so throughout the course of my time with you all today, I am going to use my journey in the realm of conservation as the vehicle through which I'll share a bit about what I've learned from wildlife and ecosystems about the nature of strong and healthy communities, the nature of healthy individual relationships that underpin these communities, and even the partnerships that we cultivate in the context of our institutions that we work in. And so you'll see a lot of representation from birds, but other wildlife as well. I'll throw some plants and maybe some single-celled organisms in there. And I'm going to touch on two main categories. Number one, what animal training can teach us about building trust. And number two, how natural systems can serve as a blueprint for community organizing and problem solving. But before I jump into that, I always want to ground myself and the folks who are generous enough to hear me speak with who I come from and where I come from. So as was mentioned, I was born and raised here in Philly, grew up in Germantown and not too far from here in South Philly. And when I was 4 or 5, my grandmother, who was a very ambitious grandmother, she was like, write down in a little book that she gave me what you want to be when you grow up. And I had a lot of vocational clarity at the age of 5. And so this note, which I'll translate, says, this is what I want to do when I grow up. I want to be an astronaut and a scientist, and I want to be a scientist on bugs and animals. I have not forgotten about the astronaut part. I still love the cosmos, so don't throw that away just yet. And I was grateful to have this love of creation, essentially, be really instilled in me from my parents. So that's a picture of my mom, who's here, my sister, who's also here, my dad, and a friend of ours. Our father passed away when I was 4, so we were very young, but I got my subject area interest from him. His bookshelves were full of books about wildlife, ecosystems, the cosmos, and so the subjects that I love today are because of what he introduced me to. And my mother really instilled in me just an absolute fascination and gratitude about the experience of life and living things and ecosystems. And so the incredible amount of joy that these subjects give me comes from my mother. And so I'm very grateful to both of them for giving me the foundation that allows me to do this work today. And so to jump in now to tell you a little bit about how my career began, as I mentioned, I started in the world of animal care as a zookeeper and started here at the Philadelphia Zoo. And I want to give a shout out to Michelle Jamison, who's the first Black wildlife biologist I ever met, and she was the lead carnivore keeper, leading the breeding programs for endangered mammals. Very cool, very cool. But over the course of my time as a keeper, I cared for about 200 different species of animals, from small invertebrates like vinegaroons and scorpions, all the way up to birds like birds of prey, hawks, owls, parrots, and even large mammals like leopards and bearcats and all kinds of really cool species. So while my taxonomic or species specialization was very broad, the thing that I really focused on as far as my specialization was animal behavior. And so there were 2 main categories in which I engaged animal behavior expertise as a keeper. Number 1, training animals to participate in their care. So just so you know, like, participate in weighing themselves, right? If we want to get weights or check the health of an animal, we want that to be voluntary. Or moving from one place to another, right? Wanting to have voluntary, low-stress care for those species, and then to exhibit natural behaviors as part of educational experiences for the guests at the zoo. And so animal training, particularly with wild animals that aren't bred to be naturally comfortable around people, provided a very unique context to practice the art of building trust. And so, as it turns out, the principles that you have to adhere to for successful animal training with wild animals are the same principles that are very critical for building trust and relationships with other people, with one another, and with our communities. And so I'm going to dive into what these principles look like. And I'll say, I've always said, being a zookeeper has helped make me a better friend and a better mother now that I have a 2-year-old who's full of energy. Okay. So, one of the things that stood out to me about Phil's introduction was talking about actions being louder than words. And in animal training, that is the name of the game. Your actions are the only language that you have. And the mechanism by which you train a wild animal or any animal is to use a method called positive reinforcement. So when you see a behavior that you want to see again, or they present a behavior that you are asking for when you ask for it, you give them something that reinforces them. For animals, that's food of some sort. That's also true for people, it turns out. And training is a partnership. So they present a behavior that you want, you give them the reinforcement, that increases the likelihood that they'll do it again when you want them to do it. As a result, animal training requires a really strong foundation of trust and ensuring that that trust maintains itself and is healthy and strong to make progress together. And the first part of this trust building process is building familiarity and doing so consistently. This is the most time-expensive part of building of the training relationship with a wild animal, and you cannot rush this process. As an example, and the amount of time that it takes can vary from species to species, individual to individual. There was a vulture who I worked with, his name was Fester, turkey vulture, you'll see a picture of him later. We were fast friends, like immediately upon being introduced, I guess you could say, to Fester, I could train him, work with him, no questions asked. However, this bird, which is a hyacinth macaw, it took me weeks, close to months, to get him to trust me enough to step onto my hand, right? If I try to rush that process, that beak you see on him has a bite pressure of 500 pounds per square inch. If I try to move him faster, move the relationship faster than the speed of trust, which you may have heard that before, that would have been a fractured wrist. Easy, right? And so it's very clear the cost of trying to rush relationship building when you're dealing with an animal with a weapon on its face like that, right? Secondly, maintaining the trust requires that you have to tell the truth. You have to be truthful in your actions. Dishonesty can be extremely costly. And you might wonder, what does this dishonesty mean when you're talking about a vulture? This is actually Fester, you can't see his face, he's a very handsome vulture. What does dishonesty look like with an animal, right? It can look like, okay, maybe Fester, the vulture, is sitting over there and I want him to fly right here. If he's over there and I present him with the back half of a mouse, which is one of the most exciting pieces of food for a vulture, right? I show him this back half of a mouse, he flies here. If I move the goalpost and then ask him to fly there without giving him that back half of a mouse, I have diluted my trust. It may not seem that deep, but it means that the next time I ask him to do something, it's much less likely that he'll do it, because I've indicated that if I show you I'll do something, I don't always follow through. And doing that repeatedly will cause that relationship to break down. And the other piece of trust, and the reason why it's costly, is not just because the relationship won't be as functional or as successful, but because trust is a lifeline when things go wrong. At the zoo, we would fly our birds outside, open air, there's nothing tethering them down. They can make any choice they want to, right? Every now and then, something would happen that would cause a bird to fly away from us, like way just off into wherever they were feeling like going to. Sometimes they were just done and were not very interested in what we had going on, and so it was more exploratory. Sometimes it was because something scared them, right? We can have audiences of 600, 700 people. Sometimes there's a kid that screams at the top of their lungs or reaches up and tries to touch a bird, and that can scare them, right? And in that situation, there was one in particular where Fester flew off very far away from where we were. If I had repeatedly broken down our trust by not doing what I said I would do, when I said I would do it, when the time came where it was a difference between safety or risk or life or death, it wasn't life or death in that situation, but if it were, we may have been in a situation where he would not have acted in his own best interest and come back to us, come back to me, right? And so when dealing with a situation like that with animals, it made me reflect on what that looks like with people. And so to put a point on it as far as what animals taught me about relationship with human beings, and then also about parenthood, as I mentioned, number one, you want to start and you have to start with building familiarity and comfort. This process cannot be rushed, whether you're talking about interpersonal one-on-one relationships or maybe you're representing an institution and you're building relationships with communities. You cannot rush the process of building familiarity and being consistent in doing so. If you rush that process, you run the risk of damaging any future potential with that entity, with that community, or with that person. And I, in institutional context, have seen this trust be breached. I used to work in community engagement for a smaller conservation organization in Georgia. And when you're an NGO that's constantly on the lookout for money and writing grants, right, you have maybe 12 months to make a deliverable happen for a grant that you've received. And I would sometimes be tasked with building relationships, executing the grant projects, and reporting on it in that 12-month period without there being time to actually build relationships with people. And what that did was break down any future proposition of working with those communities again. And I learned a lot in that experience. And I think that we can apply that recognition to all kinds of contexts as we work with communities and with other individuals. Number 2, build your trust with actions. The question that I ask now, after having worked with such a diversity of species, again, frogs, this even applies to frogs, okay? Not just like our community members and the individuals who work and live with. It applies to really any living thing. But the thing that I ask myself now is, how would I treat this person? What would I do to build their trust if I didn't have the luxury of a shared language to convince them to trust me? Actions can make or break trust in an instant, no matter how much time was invested to build the trust to where it is today. And when it comes to animals, if you do something to break that trust, you can't apologize. Apology means nothing to them. You can't explain yourself. You can't explain why you did what you did. You can't convince them with your words to trust you again. You literally have to start all over, if you can even start over again. And so we should, in our relationships with people and with communities and with even other organizations, for example, we should operate with the same sensitivity and live as though we don't have access to the capacity to apologize or convince people to trust us with language. And I will say that having a child has put this to the test for me, particularly this age 2 period that we're in right now, because you have to do a lot of work to build trust without a shared language. Like for the first part of their life, they don't know what you're saying, right? All they can see is what you're doing. And then when they turn 2, they start doing things that can make you feel tempted to act on your emotions at times. And you have to bring yourself back and recognize all I have are my actions right now to influence this young person's behavior, to show them that I love them. So being a zookeeper has paid dividends in my ability to be a parent. So I'm very grateful for that. Number 3, intentional reinforcement is very powerful. Intentionally reinforcing the behaviors that we appreciate of members of our communities, people in our family, our children, our spouses, our friends, is very powerful. Not in a manipulative way, right? So if someone does something, they give you attention, or they do something you like and you slap them a donut, or you do something in return, almost like as a transaction. I don't mean that way, but in an appreciative way that encourages behaviors that are healthy for the relationships in that community, in that organization, in that family. Reinforcement, positive reinforcement that is purposeful and intentional is extremely powerful. And then number 4, trust is and can be a lifesaver. When people that we love or ourselves are in vulnerable positions, knowing that there is even one person that we can trust, who has shown us with our actions that they can be trusted, there are times when having that available to you, that kind of a relationship, that kind of a person can be the difference between life and death. And we should treat the way that we build these relationships with that in mind. So whether we're talking about a friend, a family, a child, or community members, we should live as though our actions, my actions, are all I have to earn a person's trust and to communicate that we love them. So, moving on a bit, after spending about 10 years working in animal care and in animal training, I returned to school to pursue my master's in biology because I wanted to study birds and their natural ecosystems and answer questions that would aid in the stewardship and management of species that are imperiled by climate change. And so when I went to school in Georgia, I was studying a small sparrow called a seaside sparrow, a species of salty sparrow, if you will. They live on the Atlantic coast. They live in these grassland-appearing ecosystems, but this is actually a salt marsh. And as homogeneous as it looks, it's actually teeming with life. It is also one of the hardest ecosystems I've ever had to navigate through. Never would have known that by looking at it from the outside. But this was truly a mind-blowing experience. I never thought I would leave Philadelphia. Not that you need to, and not that you should, right? I just never thought I could, which is a different thing. And all I was used to was what Philly, the kind of ecosystems and species and experiences that I had living in Germantown or here in South Philly. And I never thought I would see this kind of thing, okay? So on the left-hand side, we have a diamondback terrapin, which is a federally protected species in that area. That's a baby. They live in the salt marsh during the early stages of their life. It's like a nursery for turtles, right? So I would come across these baby turtles. Amazing, right? The second picture in the middle is actually, it's an invasive species, but still fascinating. Like, the fact that they're invasive is not their fault. They're a very cool species of snail, periwinkle snail. I would watch them just climb up the grass and munch on the leaves, right? That there is a very angry crab. Marshes are full of crabs that you will constantly be upsetting as you walk through the mud, right? So I was pissing crabs off left and right. But it was very cool to just watch these amazing invertebrates and their complex behaviors, social interactions, mating rituals, and whatever else they got going on out there. I had manatees swimming next to me in the marsh. I had dolphins porpoising in the marsh water. I had a shark swim over my foot, y'all, while I was in the marsh. It was good, that was a good thing. I never thought I would have experiences like that. And so it has really changed my life. This, however, is also the same place where I began to connect the dots between injustice and the needs that conservation seeks to address, which is now the foundation of the work that I do as a professional. And I want to very briefly explain what this looks like. So this is also the same place where I took that picture of the turtle. You didn't see this in the background because it was a good angle. But if I were to turn the background to a different angle, you would see this huge paper mill. During certain days in the summer, this paper mill that is literally across the street from where I was, would be churning out some mystery pollution, and it would burn me in my chest. Like, it would be difficult to breathe as I'm tromping through the marsh looking for sparrow nests, right? And of course, the people that live immediately around this polluting industry are predominantly Black and predominantly low-income communities. And what I realized, and what I knew from experience, but hadn't put together until I was literally unable to breathe in one of those beautiful ecosystems that I'd ever seen, was that these issues are connected. Ahmaud Arbery, who's on the left-hand side here, was a young man who lived in Brunswick, Georgia, which is where my research site was. He lived in an area that I would drive through every day. He was jogging through a neighborhood in Brunswick and was chased down by 3 racist white men and killed in broad daylight in the middle of the street. And it was filmed, right? They filmed it themselves. And that was the second moment, I think, when I realized that it's not just about environment, right? So yes, there are threats to our ecosystems, to our water, to our air that are very costly, but there are also these social threats from other people that are along racial lines, socioeconomic lines, that are threatening the lives of people. Ahmaud Arbery is no longer here because he was tracked down by racists. And so as incredible and beautiful and serene as some of these places that I work and other biologists, for example, may seem, depending on who you are, your life could be in danger by being there in the short term, as in the case of Ahmaud Arbery, or in the long term, if you're exposed for decades to pollution like this. And so I realized that conservation can and should intersectionally address social injustices in the same places where we're concerned about biodiversity, birds, crabs, dolphins, sharks, right? We should also be invested in the people and their ability to live well. It was also in this context that I began to draw the connections between how systems in nature function. And actually, before I get there, let me just zero in on this. How many of you have heard of the principles of environmental justice, the 17 principles of environmental justice, right? I want to just highlight that for you, and if you haven't heard of those, to look them up. They're not principles that are only relevant to people who work in the environmental sectors. It's relevant for everyone. But as a conservation scientist, it is my duty to recognize and abide by these. And just to highlight a few, environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. It affirms the fundamental right to political, economic, cultural, and environmental self-determination for all peoples. It demands that public policy be based on mutual respect and justice for all peoples, free from any form of discrimination or bias, and it demands the right to participate as equal partners at every level of decision making. So I wanted to just put that here as just a few examples of these principles of environmental justice that should apply to any work that anyone does and that I work to apply in conservation science and policy. Circling back now to what I began to understand about what nature itself can tell us, I really did begin to draw these connections between systems that exist at multiple scales, whether we're talking about microbiology and cell biology, all the way up to ecosystems. And it gives us wisdom about how we can apply these processes and ways of existing to our social systems, the places where we live and grow and problem solve. And so, one of the first contexts in which I recognize this is diversity. Whether you're talking about your chromosomes, the DNA in any particular individual, or you're talking about an ecosystem, diversity is critical for problem solving. It's critical for survival. One of the reasons why we don't recommend having children with siblings or close relatives is because your offspring may have genetic vulnerabilities combined that produce dangerous diseases in the offspring, right? It can be very costly to have extremely homogeneous genetic makeup. Same is true for a species, right? A population. If every individual in a population, say of black-footed ferrets, is genetically identical, that means that if one individual is susceptible to a certain disease or a certain stressor, all of them are. And if one of those stressors comes along, it is extremely unlikely that any of their genetic makeup would have the answer to the problem, would have the solution to the stressor. And so it makes a population extremely vulnerable and precarious. If we're talking about an ecosystem, right? This is an aquatic marine ecosystem here, and you have nothing but white-tailed deer and no predators. What happens? The vegetation gets torn down, decimated, and you can risk ecosystem collapse. If you have too much of one thing or one kind of thing, you risk not being able to have a robust, healthy, functioning ecosystem. And this connection around diversity was made for me because in every single one of my degree programs and places of employment, I was either the only non-white person or one of extremely few. And I was witnessing what homogeneity cost us in creativity, in lived experience, in perspective. And when your work impacts people, if you are wanting to engage with or make decisions about the environments of people and you have no one represented from those places, you can risk problem solving in a way that creates more problems for those communities, and conservation has demonstrated that over and over again. But thankfully, as I went through my career, and especially in 2020, I was able to get connected with lots and lots of Black and Latino and Indigenous biologists and learn from so many different perspectives. I just want to highlight a few people. Dr. Deja Perkins, she's an ornithologist. She just graduated with a PhD. She has been studying the relationship between how data about wildlife and biodiversity fall along racial and socioeconomic lines around the country and what we can do about that. Isaiah Scott is a young scholar. He just graduated from Cornell University, and he's a scientist and artist, and has been working to connect Black people with their ancestors and the environmental experiences that they had through nature-based art. And Ms. Corliss Clare is a community member of mine in Atlanta, where I now live, who is not a biologist or an ecologist, and she would absolutely not want to be framed as such. But she's been fighting for the environmental health of her community, and that's actually her with my son Malcolm. They really have a good time together. But it turns out that nature has even more to tell us about how to live well and how to work well with one another. And in recent times, and these times are certainly ongoing, there have been repeated gross violations of human rights across the country. People have been increasingly targeted based on their skin color, their accent, their immigration status, their language, and innocent civilians have been killed in the process of targeting these folks. People who are truth tellers, whether they're journalists or they're scientists, or people serving in their communities have been targeted. And the folks that are in our current, unfortunately, administration have been perpetuating a lot of these realities for communities across the country. And so now, as much as, if not more than ever, it's really helpful for us to turn to nature and figure out what wisdom we can glean about how we can organize to protect each other and distribute resources to make sure everyone has what they need. And in cities across the country, and I want to highlight Minnesota because they have been doing some amazing organizing in recent months. there's been a lot of biomimicry in action. Not that they necessarily recognize that or were intentional for, to be mimicking animal behavior, for example, but I identified it and I saw it. It was fascinating. And so I'm going to now pivot to share with you a couple of animal and plant and fungi highlights about how they operate in nature and what that tells us about how we can operate well together. And so the first one here, this is San Diego Zoo. These are some elephants. And I think this was last year or a couple of years ago, there was an earthquake in San Diego, and one of the security cameras that was facing the elephant exhibit captured this moment where when the ground started shaking, the larger adult elephants surrounded immediately the smallest elephant in the herd to ensure that they were the first line of defense against whatever was causing this disturbance. And so you can see the larger elephants around the edge and the smaller elephant in the middle. And the question that I immediately asked of myself was, in my community, am I aware of the vulnerabilities or concerns of my own community members, of my own neighbors? Have I built enough of a relationship with my community members to know the best actions to take if or when necessary to protect more vulnerable neighbors in any particular context? And all of us have different vulnerabilities, so sometimes we need to be in the middle, right? Sometimes you may need to be the one in the middle. Sometimes you may need to be the one on the outside, depending on the risk that's at hand. And it really reminded me, I saw a couple of interviews with some white male priests in Minnesota who were calling on other white male priests to physically stand in the gap, to put their bodies on the line to protect their immigrant community members and members of their faith communities, because they were going to be the ones least likely to have the worst impacts from interacting with federal agents. They recognized that, and so they put themselves, their bodies, between those agents and their community members. During the same time, a lot of nonprofits were sharing information to help people know how to organize. They were sharing principles, sharing ideas to help people understand the best ways to respond to a threat when it emerged. And one of these posts mentioned something called rotating vigilance. And I was like, meerkats do that. If you've ever been at a zoo and watched meerkats, even in a zoo environment, they do this. There's essentially a role called a sentinel, where a meerkat, while everyone else is eating, sleeping, taking care of the younger ones, at least one meerkat is tasked with keeping their eyes in the skies and keeping their eyes on the landscape to watch if there is a threat that emerges. And the moment that a threat emerges, it is that meerkat's job to alert the entire colony of meerkats that they need to take cover, and they all run underground. If it was the same meerkat all the time, that meerkat would burn out. Would burn out very quickly. It would be a burnt out meerkat. All right? So that role rotates throughout the community of meerkats. And same with people. It's important, especially in times of social upheaval, that you are keeping your eyes on the landscape. Someone is, and you can rotate whose responsibility it is to do that very job. Now I want to zero in on our single-celled friends. And I'm going to try to wrap up very quickly here. Amoeba are actually like where all of our answers are for literally everything. If you get a chance to just dig into amoeba a bit, I highly recommend it. This was actually a behavior, if you can call it that my friend Billy, who I mentioned earlier, kind of put me onto. So a lot of species of amoeba, which typically move throughout the world as a single-celled organism, in response to scarce resources, usually when it comes to food, they can assemble themselves by the hundreds of thousands or even millions into functionally what is one single organism to move across their landscape more effectively and with less cost to every individual until they can find more food again. And then once the resources are available, they all kind of disseminate and disassociate back into their individual units. And what this really tells us is that organizing and leadership, the scale of those can and should be adaptable depending on how we have to mobilize to protect each other. On a daily basis, we may just be paying close attention to the folks in our block, or the folks in our church, or the folks at our job, right? So a very small unit. But there are times when we do have to mobilize en masse, whether it's it's Philadelphia, or it's the region, or it's the state, or it's the country, and we should build connections across these scales that allow us to mobilize very quickly, so that when there's a threat, whether it's federal or political or policy related, regardless of the scale, we have a way to address it and to move together to make sure that everyone is protected and that everyone has what they need. Okay, fungi. excuse me, I don't know if we have any mycologists in here, fungi. Plants and fungi can have a very cool relationship, symbiotic relationship in nature, and certain fungi can form what are essentially these networks. They're called mycorrhizal networks that are underground that essentially extend the surface area, if you will, of the root systems of trees. And it allows for trees and other plants to more efficiently uptake water, uptake nutrients. And these fungi can also redistribute nutrients across the landscape to where they are needed most, which is absolutely fascinating. They can move resources from areas of higher concentration to lower concentration in the direction of greatest need, and they can change where those nutrients are distributed based on changing conditions, and even to do so between plant species. So just a very quick example. So there's a species called a yellow trout lily, and there are species called sugar maples. We have sugar maples here, and they are often located together in ecosystems together. And the mycorrhizal networks under the ground in spring will funnel a lot of nutrient resources to the maples because that's the time of year when they're producing, unfurling their leaves. It takes a lot of energy, it's very energy expensive, and those fungi will therefore move resources towards those species. In the fall is the yellow trout lilies who are expending a lot of energy. They're creating these really long and deep root systems in the fall. And so during that time of year, the mycorrhizal network will move nutrients away from the maples and towards the trout lilies because now they need the nutrients. And what I always think about when I think of these fungi is, wow, we don't do anything as efficient as this when it comes to moving resources around in our human communities. And as we are all, I'm sure, well aware, our society and societies have really been fixed in a state of gross resource inequity, and the systems that we do have for moving resources around and getting resources to the people that need them have been very inefficient and layered with bureaucracy and other challenges. The granting, the philanthropy space, for example, and I'm certainly not going to get on the soapbox about that, but if you work in the NGO space, I'm sure you've experienced it. And so the question that I ask of myself and that I ask of you all today is that how can each of us, in whatever context that we live and work, in our communities or institutions or families even, how can we come up with innovative ways, creative ways, to dynamically redistribute resources to where they need to go in response to who needs what? This includes financial resources, technical resources, and whatever other resources are relevant to the spaces where we live, work, worship, and more. So think of the fungi and the fungi when you're thinking of the resources that you have to offer to others. Okay, and so I'm going to end now on birds because birds are my go-to and they're beautiful. How many of you have seen this before? Murmuration, right? So starlings, which they're not native to here, they're still amazing and beautiful and do this very amazing display. A murmuration is essentially this cloud of birds that can be as small as a few hundred birds or as large as 1 million, where they're moving essentially as a cloud of birds with amazing acrobatics and synchrony. And as beautiful as this is actually a threat response. If you were able to look closely enough, outside of a murmuration, there's going to be a bird of prey. It might be a falcon or a hawk or some other hunting bird that is trying to just pick off one starling. But this incredible display is how every single bird in that flock reduces the likelihood that any particular individual, any given individual, would be caught by this predator. Every time I see this, I'm like, how does this even happen? How does this not become a crashing, chaotic behavior in the sky? And there are a couple of things that make this happen. And again, my friend Billy is the one who put me on to looking at this behavior and using how they function to inform how we function as people. So one of the first things they do is that every single bird in that flock of up to 1 million is paying closest attention to the 7 or so birds around them. They're generally paying attention to the whole flock, but the closest attention is to the individuals that are closest to them. Number 2, leadership is distributed. If these birds acted like how some of our politicians act, hanging on to power long past when they should, wanting to usurp the spotlight, right, they would crash. They would not be able to accomplish this. The fact that leadership can be dynamic, that it can change, that many people can be leading at one time, that different birds lead at different times, allows them to achieve this level of coordination and make sure that no bird gets picked off by the predator. And so, when I think about murmurations, number one, again, I ask myself, am I paying close attention, any attention, to the people who are closest to me? Sometimes it's easier to pay the least amount of attention to the people who are closest to us because there might be a level of familiarity or they just kind of become part of the background, the ways of life. But we really should be paying close attention to the people who are closest to us, whether that's family, neighbors, people who live in our communities or in our workspaces. And having that level of care and attention to our surroundings scales up, and that's how reverberations can even happen. Number two, some of us need to work on identifying where we can provide leadership in our communities and build confidence to provide it. Others of us need to practice being comfortable letting other people lead, even people who are younger than us, more junior than us, because there are times when those people will have the expertise needed to lead in a given moment, even if we're the more senior person, even if we've been the ones who everyone answers to. We have to be willing to let that leadership go. This is true in institutional contexts, and this is true in our social and community contexts as well. So in closing, the ultimate truth that I have come to realize is that for me to apply what I've learned from studying species as an ecologist and their ecosystems to building trust with individual creatures is that when it comes to people, it really does take love to live this way. It is a very expensive way to live. It can be, energetically. But love is what makes it possible to be consistent when you are exhausted, to be calm when you are angry and frustrated, and to put your body on the line for somebody else, and to build honest, trusting community that is sustainable for the long haul. And so I encourage you, as you explore the outdoors, if you're a birder, I know there are a few birders in the room, or if you just sit outside and watch whatever nature passes by you, to pay close enough attention that you can discern the wisdom that really is found at every scale at which life exists, and the systems that drive it. And we will all be much better for it. Thank you.
Questions for Corina? Joe?
Yeah, that was an excellent presentation. There's been experiments where they show that trust has a very weak equilibrium, whereas when you lose that trust, it's a very strong equilibrium. You've mentioned that where once trust is lost, you may not be able to earn it back, but it takes a while to do so. How do you do that, and what is the distinction? Like, how would you draw the correlation between humans as well as in the animal kingdom?
Yeah, so when it comes to animals, sometimes what it would take to rebuild that trust is, like the time that it would take is not available. And there have been situations where someone did something that broke an animal's trust and you just don't work with them again, right? It's like you don't have time to be here all day, all night, to spend all of your attention on that individual, and so it's just done, right? Of course, I don't like to have that perspective on people, and so I try to be much more flexible and encourage people to be much more flexible when it comes to human communities, but I have seen that it requires, humility is really kind of what it is. It's the name of the game when it comes to people, also animals. They can sense when you're walking in with a little too much confidence. But I think that in my experience, recognizing if harm has been done or trust has been broken, even if it wasn't you, even if you weren't the person who did it, but you are representing an organization that did, right? Which is, I have unfortunately been in that situation more than I would like to think about. I have to move at their pace. And if they tell me that they have no interest, I have to respect that. And so it can feel hurtful to be on this side of that equation sometimes, but humility and being willing to follow the speed of the person who you are trying to gain, whose trust you're trying to gain, is really all that we can do, I think, as people.
Other questions?
I just want to say that presentation was very exciting from the very beginning to the very last word. But I have a question about the trust issue where you're talking. Do the lions, big cats, can you build trust with them so they won't eat you for some reason?
No, so that's interesting. So with a wild animal, there always has to be the boundary. It's like there is a boundary that should never be crossed, even when you've worked with them for years and years. So with big cats, no matter how much I love them, right, or how much they trust me, there is always going to be a threshold that we don't cross for safety, because we aren't built like them. And so what is playful to them could be deadly to us. And so we recognize that. I don't have a good like human comparison for that dynamic. It really is the big cats that require those kind of boundaries. But yeah, good question.
Other questions?
So how did you get started in conservation-specific work? And was that difficult for you specifically as like a Black woman?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. So I got into it because a friend of my mom's at our church, he was like, "Oh, my sister works at the zoo. I'll give you her number," right? And the crazy thing was, like, because I had literally never seen a Black person working as a wildlife expert, I assumed, that I'm ashamed to even think this, that she worked like in like administration somewhere or concessions or just some non-animal job. I was like, there's no way, she works with animals. And it turned out that she was the lead carnivore keeper, right? So I was humbled quickly. But I had her number, I called her, and she really took me under her wing. She took me behind the scenes. She showed me how she trained a giant river otter. She was introducing me, helping me network, giving me all kinds of advice, and introducing me to careers that I would never have known otherwise. And that, unfortunately, is the experience of a lot of Black people coming into this field. It's like you happen to know somebody, which shouldn't be the case, right? I feel like the general public has a good understanding of what a doctor is, how you do that, or a lawyer. But when it comes to conservation, that path is not very clear, and it's kind of a who-you-know situation. But she got me into the Philadelphia Zoo. She got me an internship in education, and I faked my way through that interview 100%. Because the job was to talk to members of the public, to talk to the guests in the zoo about the animals. And I had a gripping fear of talking to anyone, any group more than like 3 to 5 people, like crippling fear. I also didn't like kids at the time. And so they were like, "How are you with kids?" "Oh, I love kids." You know what I mean? I'm not recommending lying. But that is what happened. And I kind of faked my confidence in speaking as well. But literally within the first couple of days of that internship, like my comfort and excitement and joy of communicating, I realized that I would never have known that I had that in me if I hadn't put myself out there. So that's kind of how it got started, and it's just been a series of generous mentor after generous mentor since then.
Other questions? Yes, Kate.
Yeah, thanks for this a lot. So you brought up the, how you got introduced into this field through the zoo, the Philadelphia Zoo. So how do you feel about zoos? How do you think we should feel about zoos?
That's a very good and deep question. There are many kinds of zoos. So all the zoos that I've worked at are accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, which are the highest standard of care for wild animals, and is science-based. Not every zoo is that way, right? So you come across a lot of zoos or wildlife parks that have all kinds of animal care standards. I believe that having an environment that caters to the well-being and natural behaviors and natural needs of wildlife is critical. And so those accredited zoos operate at that standard. And I know from experience that there is an incredible amount of attention paid to the stress level of animals, right? We can literally measure how stressed an animal is by taking its blood, looking at its cortisol. We look very closely, and so they are managed to their environments, their diets, everything, their behavior is managed in such a way to ensure that they are at peace in their living situations. And so accredited zoos, I support accredited zoos, they're conservation organizations, and my experience with them has affirmed that. But not every animal care facility is that way.
Someone over here, something.
I share your love of Blue Jays. It took me weeks to get the Blue Jay to take a peanut out of my hand.
Oh,
And the trust resonating with the trust factor, and I had to be patient. The bird was not going to go on my time. And eventually it got to the point where it said, okay, I think I can trust you. I'm curious what drew you to the blue jay, because that's a weird bird.
It is. So I actually, birds were the least interesting group of wildlife to me, period. Like as a kid, all the way through college, and I knew I had to take ornithology as a course in undergrad, and I was dreading it. From the time I entered college as a freshman, I knew as a junior, I'm gonna have to memorize 300 species of North American birds by sight and sound, and I was like, I've never even seen most of these. Like, how are there 300 species to even know, right? Turns out there's like 1,000 across North America. But I had been dreading this class for so long, and on the first day of that class, my professor, Dr. Jason Corder, who I love to this day, I love so much for this, he was introducing us to some of the most common birds in Northeast Ohio, which is where I went to school. And he went through a cardinal, I was familiar with that, went through a robin, and then he put a blue jay up on the screen, and it said blue jay, and I literally, in the middle of class, yelled, "What is that?" Right? Like, I had heard of a blue jay. I thought a blue jay was something like this, right? I'd heard the name, never seen the bird. And at this point, I had been in college for wildlife, for a wildlife degree for 3 years. And everyone was like, "You've never seen a blue jay? Like, wait, what's wrong with you?" Right? And so I was like, okay, wait. As I was leaving that class to go to my next class, and I walked outside, blue jays were everywhere. And I'm like, if I, as a biologist who's in school for this, racking up student loans for this, didn't even notice these huge, loud, beautiful birds, what is everyone else missing, right? So it hooked me, and then it hooked me into hooking other people, if that makes sense. So they were my spark bird, is what people oftentimes call that experience with a species of bird. So thank you for asking.
Hi, I'm a longtime member of the Philadelphia Zoo, and until COVID, I was a volunteer there, and I've noticed over the years that peacocks have gone away, and I'm wondering, I rarely see them. I'm wondering, and at night when I used to have an employee pass, I could get in at night, they'd be up roosting up in the trees, no more, and I'm wondering if you know why.
I don't know why. I'm really sorry. I wish I could share. I can imagine it to be a number of things. Having free roaming peacocks is cool, but it requires a lot of resources to care for them in that environment, and so it may have just been a resource choice to say, hey, when these last peacocks, pass away, we're not going to get any more. So it may have been that, but I can't weigh in on that, unfortunately. I'm sorry. But I'm also sad to hear that they're not.
They're hard to find.
Yeah.
Question from Zoom. Ken asks, you talk about cruel animal behaviors that we might emulate, and then paraphrasing, what can we learn from animals more selfish or individualistic behavior, or how do you cope with that, right? Because maybe not trying to emulate that.
Oh yeah, there are plenty of behaviors you don't want to repeat out of the animal kingdom, right? And so I'm glad actually that he asked that question, because I never want to kind of fantasize nature or species interaction. There is brutality, there's death, there's violence in nature, there's competition in nature, right? And that absolutely exists. And there are things that we don't want to repeat or model as human beings. And where I come from really is that there's a mixed bag. There's a lot of information that nature provides, a lot of very important information that can help us just problem solve. If you boil it down to that, nature, the earth has been, and life on earth has been in existence for billions of years at this point. And so there has been a lot of trial and error that if we just paid attention to it, we could apply that very long-term trial and error process to some of the problems we're trying to find answers to, not in a way that makes it seem like that nature is just kind of this paradise at all times. And great apes are actually some of the ones that exhibit behaviors that you may not want to repeat at home. But great apes are still cool, they're very cool. But thank you for that question and allowing me to provide that clarity.
Thank you for the talk today. I do have a question, but I also want to mention that Isaiah Scott, who you mentioned in your presentation, is speaking at the Academy of Natural Sciences on Thursday, May 8th. So
I have to know him.
Yeah, so you can learn more at the website, ansp.org.
Cool.
So you mentioned kind of the challenge in the nonprofit world of getting appropriate funding or long enough lasting funding to build trust with communities who are impacted by environmental justice issues. What would you say for folks in the nonprofit landscape? How can we convince funders to kind of change funding structures to better support relationship building? I know that's like a big question. But any thoughts that you have from your own experience would be appreciated.
Yeah, so I've been learning a lot, and I would highly recommend folks, if you're in the nonprofit sector fundraising, there's someone named Vu Lei who has an organization, I guess you could call it, called Nonprofit AF, and he talks about equity in the funding and philanthropic landscape, and he provides a lot of very cool and important answers to this very question. One of the things that I've learned from him is that bringing yourselves together, so even if you don't ordinarily work with X number of nonprofits in your sector or in your geographic area, if you can band together to provide feedback to granting institutions to elucidate this, and I will say private philanthropy is doing better. They're like recognizing and slowly internalizing the fact that you cannot rush the relationship building or the kind of foundational work that needs to happen before the project takes place. And so I encourage that, but simultaneously I always encourage organizations to do the work of community and relationship building outside of the context of any particular grant or deliverable or project, so that when one of these very fast timeline grants comes along, you already have that trust there and you're not trying to do it all in the 6 or 12 or 18-month time period that you have. And people, community members across sectors recognize how philanthropic entities go. They know that there's not usually a lot of time, but it's really on the organization to put in that pre-work and maintain that so that when the funding comes along, they can mobilize as quickly as they need to. Question? Oh, sorry.
Hi, obviously going into a community, it can be very large, a lot of individual people. It's difficult to form relationships one by one with individuals. With animals, I'm curious whether you form relationships and build trust with an individual animal, and then you become sort of like the gateway human to the whole, collection of the animals there, and they see you and how you interact, and then they're more, it's easier to approach them. How does that work?
That's actually, I'm so glad you asked that, because that's exactly how it works. And in the context of like community engagement, what I often say to people is that we don't typically have time to do all of this really intense, time-consuming relationship building that's required for personal relationships with individuals, but there are people with those relationships already. And how can you build trust with those people who have the network already so that resources can be disseminated, partnerships can be facilitated, they don't require you as an individual spending all of that time per person. And that actually is how animal training often works. There will be a lead trainer. So I was the lead trainer for the Binturongs, for example, right? And so I'm investing hours upon hours upon hours in my relationship with those animals. Everyone does not have the time for that because they all are lead trainers for other species. But because I have that, I can be in the room and I can bring in a new face, and that person will be able to facilitate a training session, for example, or an interaction, or animal care, or treatment, right? Because I'm there and I'm facilitating that interaction. If it were just them and the bearcat, or the Binturong, then it wouldn't happen. So yeah, that same dynamic is at play. And so I'm glad you said that. I'm going to think more about that. Thank you.
Charles. So first of all, I'm very disappointed because I'm from St. Louis, so there's not a cardinal there. A blue jay, but that's inside baseball talk. I love your presentation, but it got me to thinking, when I was taking my young children to the St. Louis Zoo, I was focused on the animals and the geography of where those animals, so that they understood, oh, when you have a penguin, it's from this place, if you have an elephant, it's from this place, etc. But there was nothing there, I'm not criticizing, but there was nothing there that talked about the things that you have talked about. So my question is, are we somewhat missing the mark, maybe in grade school or elementary school, in teaching the relationship between animals and how they interact with each other, and how you can take some of those conversations to how people should interact with each other?
I'm so glad you asked that. Absolutely. I continue to be so grieved that it wasn't until I was getting a degree in this field that I even learned about the nature of these interactions, even before you get to what can we learn from it as people, right? There is such an opportunity for nature, natural systems, nature-based relationships to be ingrained into the education of our young people, and it's just missing. And one of the things that breaks my heart about our education systems now is that, this is not news to anyone, but you teach to the test. It's about standardized learning and testing. It's like there's so little taught that kind of grows the person and their ability to steward and interact with and understand the world around them. And so I I encourage folks, even if it's not your sector or your realm of expertise per se, and one of the reasons why I'm so excited about Camp Linden is because as much as we can facilitate or fill in the gap when it comes to that education and drawing those connections for young people, we should, because you just become a better thinker and a better problem solver, a better friend when you understand some of these dynamics and how you fit into it, how you fit into your ecosystem. So I 100% believe we're missing the mark and hope that more of us can do more to get us on the mark.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I really appreciated your presentation. My question is about something else, but I wanted to acknowledge how it was really interesting learning about social justice within nature and seeing how we can take examples from what's around us. My question was about mentorship. So I'm a teacher and I work in youth development prior to teaching also. And I'm wondering, are there areas for mentorship for people of color to get into environmental sciences?
Yes, there are several. Thank you for asking that. So I'll just name off a few that I'm aware of. So there's an organization called Black and Marine Science, BIMS, which is full of Black professionals in the marine sciences, from folks in college all the way up to PhD graduates doing all kinds of really cool research that is justice-centered. So that's a great vehicle. There's an organization called Black Women in Evolution and Ecology and Marine Biology, BWEAMS. There are several. That's another one. It's women focused, that one. There are organizations that are more kind of conservation at large focused, not necessarily biological expertise. Latino Outdoors is an organization that's national, that does a lot of community organizing and empowering communities to take conservation actions at the policy and landscape level. And there are more, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to share more names with you. But all those organizations welcome the engagement of young people to, some of them have formal mentorship opportunities, some of them are more informal, but they're all ways for young people to plug in and learn more about how they can pursue those paths.
Okay, unfortunately, we're gonna have to end the Q&A portion here, but I have one last question, Corina. Will you commit now, and without any hesitation, to running for president? You're an announcer here at Technical Side, and we will wait today for you. I will run the campaign.
I cannot express how honored I am you would say that. As one legislator who I know in Georgia said, after this term, I'm not running for the bus. That's not how I feel about politics, but I appreciate you saying that.
Thank you, Corina. Big round of applause for Corina. Okay, so now is the moment in the program where we move into committee announcements. We go from climax thrilling to very boring announcements about upcoming things that are happening. Committee announcements. Who has different things that are happening that we want to talk about coming up at the Ethical Society? Got tons of programs. Susan, I will run the mic.
I just need to announce that the Education Committee will not be meeting this Wednesday. I have another commitment that I need to do. So I think what I'll do is reach out to the committee and find a date and time that we can all get together, rather than just jump out and name a date. So expect an email from me. Thanks.
Susan? Joe?
Yes, the Philadelphia Stoics will be meeting this afternoon. We'll be covering the last part, the idea of disciplined assent and how we make our judgments. And we'll be going over a set of practical exercises and incorporating philosophy. So you have to see their 3 o'clock.
Thank you, Joe. Philadelphia Stoa meets almost weekly here upstairs. Other committee announcements? Oh, sorry, Lindsay. Yes, wonderful.
We have our next family volunteer event next Sunday at 10, so it's here upstairs right before platform. We are working with an organization called Grab and Flow, which provides period products, postpartum products to people who need it. We're going to be doing bundles, little packages. So anyone who would like to come join us upstairs at 10 a.m. Because it is Mother's Day, our RSVP level is a little bit lower. So anyone who might not otherwise be inclined to come, usually there are a bunch of kids, but we would love to have others next Sunday. Hope to see you there.
Thank you, Lindsay. want to say from the Camp Linden side, because we have Amy and Paul from Camp Linden here, we put up an exhibit about what goes on up at Camp Linden. And so if people are interested in Camp Linden and the 6-week summer education, swimming and summer environmental education program, please, let's see, Amy, raise your hand again. Just so if people are sticking around, Amy and Paul are less in town often because they're out in Chester near the camp. So this is a wonderful opportunity to connect directly about the camp and what we do there and the upcoming volunteer opportunities, camping trips we take out there.
Is that an overnight camp?
It is not anymore. It used to be an overnight camp. It's a day camp. So every basically different community partners from Philly, mostly North and South Philly, but also from Chester County, take their camps out for a full day from the morning till the late afternoon, and do swimming and earth science education. And they go out there every day, once a week for 6 weeks, moving through the curriculum. So they come out, again, to this issue of trust, they come out with trust-based relationships already with their existing camps. And then when they come out and meet Paul and Amy and the rest of the team, they already have a group cohesion, and so they're just ready to play with the bugs and run. And maybe Sharon's going to correct me. Sharon's a chair of the Camp Linden Committee. Please.
Now, I just wanted to tell you, if you want more information, you should look to this Camp Linden pages on the Ethical Society website. And that includes detailed discussion of our 6-week curriculum.
Thank you, Sharon. Okay. Any other upcoming? Oh, I do want to say, so once a month we do an introduction to ethical culture. I got into a little bit at the beginning today, but essentially once a month for those who want to dig deeper into the philosophy behind the theory of change and this focus on social action that we have that goes back to the 1870s. We do a deeper dive, and the one that's coming up is this coming Wednesday, May 6th, here in the building. And so you can find all these events on our website, but that's the next introduction to ethical culture. That is 6 to 8, I believe. It's on the website. But, let me make sure. Okay, so before we ask Jake to come up and close us out with a song, we have a reflection from Lee and the Ending Racism Task Force. Lee, can you come up? I can bring the mic down to you. You on?
I was driving through Sussex County, Delaware, and passed a sign for a housing development. It read, Patty Cannon Estates. And I felt it immediately, that jolt of recognition followed by anger, because I knew that name. Years ago, I had read The Entailed Hat by George Alfred Townsend, and it led me to learn about the real person behind the story, Patty Cannon. For anyone who may not know, just briefly, she was part of a gang operating the Delaware-Maryland border in the early 1800s. A gang that kidnapped 3 black people, many from this region, including Philadelphia, and sold them into slavery. Others were murdered. We know this not just from legend, but from the accounts of victims themselves, preserved in the papers of Joseph Watson, the 57th mayor of Philadelphia. Those accounts describe something chilling, that 3 black communities lived with the constant fear of being seized and sold into slavery. Eventually, bodies were discovered, including those of a child and an infant, and the gang was finally brought to light. That is the legacy. And yet today, there is a quiet residential neighborhood that bears her name. So seeing that sign raised a simple question for me. How does something like this happen? And maybe more importantly, what does it say about us that it remains? When I read more about the development, I found a range of reactions. Some residents feel discomfort, even embarrassment. Others were indifferent. Some say changing the name would be erasing history. But I think there's an important distinction here. There's a difference between remembering history and honoring it. No one is suggesting that we forget Patty Cannon. Her story should be known because it reveals a painful and often overlooked part of our history. But naming a neighborhood after her, that isn't remembrance. It is, whether intended or not, a kind of recognition. And that leads to an ethical question. Whose names do we choose to live with? We would likely find it unthinkable to name a community after someone like Timothy McVeigh. And yet here we are. At the very least, it should give us pause. And it should also turn our attention to the people whose names we don't know, the victims, the men, women, and children who were taken, who were sold, who were killed. Many of them were free people living in Philadelphia, people who believed they had some measure of safety. They are the ones who deserve to be remembered. What I do find encouraging is that awareness is growing. There are articles, conversations, questions being asked. And reading about these efforts led me to ask, what can I do? And maybe more importantly, what can we do together? Because given Philadelphia's connection to many of the victims, it feels especially appropriate that awareness might grow here too. Through conversation, through education, and perhaps through action. As you know, ethical living isn't just about what we believe in principle, indeed before creed. It's about how we respond when the past shows up in the present, clearly and with discomfort. I don't yet know what my own response will be, but I do know this: passing that sign was not a neutral moment. It was a call to awareness and maybe to action. Thank you.
Few trips down those stairs. We don't want that. Okay, we have one more announcement. I'm going to bring about fundraising concert. And we're going to bring to Jake. So Jake, if you're why don't you come on, Jake?
Morning, everybody. My name's Steve. I play in a rock metal punk band. We're called Ego Bread, EGOBREAD. And I want to promote just we play exclusively benefit concerts to raise funds for social justice causes. We actually had one here at the Ethical Society back in March, and not to toot our own horn too much, but we raised $500 for Juntos. So that was pretty cool. So we got another one coming up this month. It's going to be on May 22nd downstairs. We're going to be doing a fundraising show for Palestine from 7 to 9. It's pay what you want. So if you're interested in that, definitely love you, have you check it out. And I'll be putting up a poster for it a little later. So thank you. Just wanted to put the word out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Okay. We're going to have Jake Kelberman. Give a round of applause for Jake Kelberman.
Thank you all so much for having me. Thank you to Phil, the Ethical Society, for putting this on at all.
Can you hear me now? Great. Yeah, I just wanted to say briefly, I'm here on behalf of an organization Phil mentioned earlier, Not So Latin. His preschool teacher, Patricio Azevedo, is his house. We will be back here presenting music on Sunday, June 14th as part of this series with the Brazilian group. We'll also be hosting a fundraiser here for the organization on Friday, June 26th. Hope to see you all there. I opened with a Brazilian piece of music called Acida Differenti, which was by a harmonica player named Mauricio Einhorn, who was a real collaborator with a lot of great American jazz musicians who would visit on tour. A lot of great art and music comes out of diverse cultural ecosystems, we believe as well. I'll close out with a song for the city of New Orleans, another great diverse cultural ecosystem. This is called Do You Know What It Means to Miss New Orleans. Thank you very much.
Every week we also have a call for support for a different organization, and we ask our guest speaker what organization we'd like to support. And I think it was so it's an, let me make sure I got that right. So there's an organization called In Color Birding. Do you want to say just a few things about the call for support?
In Color Birding is a birding club here in Philly, the Philly area for Black and Brown community members and allies to enjoy birds together, and they do a lot of investment really out of the personal pocket of the guy who leads it. His name is Jason, and he takes school kids out to like John Hines Natural Area, connects community members around their love of birds, and I cannot recommend investing and contributing to their mission enough.
Thank you, Corina. So yeah, Mike and Hannah will be going around. If you have any cash to donate to In Color Birding, you can also, of course, if you don't have any cash, check